Welcome back, folks. In this session we'll be looking at the development of, or a framework for the development of formal tax policies in an organization. Now, not everybody is very comfortable with this topic because sometimes the procedures or the policies are seen as rigid and policing and all sorts of things, infringing on my personal rights and freedoms. But that's exactly what the policy is about. It takes away uncertainty, it pegs where the buck stops, and that is absolutely necessary in an environment where there's a significant stakeholder outside of the business called SARS. So let's look at some of those principles. So what are the building blocks of a good policy? It should have an appropriate level of inclusivity, but you will never get a full inclusion. There's always somebody that's going to push back and say, I don't like that, I don't like that. So you need to get a level that's acceptable within your organization. And then there must be clarity of communication. Everybody must know what the policy is. And consistency in application. It has no benefit if you've got the best policies in your organization and they do not get applied. Or even worse, they get applied depending on who you're dealing with. That brings a dynamic into the organization that you have not applied it for that person, I also don't want it applied to me, which means the policy is absolutely not worth the paper it's written on. And the policy must provide feedback. So there must be a mechanism in the policy by which feedback is forced, and then how do you deal with that feedback. So those are the basic principles we'll be looking at if you're building solid policies in an organization. So what are the generic scopes of policies that you need? You need operational and risks. So how do I identify risks? How do I link that to operations? And remember what we said in the past, let the main thing be the main thing and stay the main thing. Don't get bogged down in issues that's not going to add value in the organization. The accounting and reporting, then tax compliance in general, automation and technology integration, that's a very important strategy, and also a policy that assists to implement a strategy. So very important that that is covered. Then organization and resources. How do you resource the tax function? How should it be resourced? With which person should it be resourced? When we look at the KPIs and the KPAs specifically for tax managers, we'll look at some of this. Are you resourcing your tax function in line with what your tax policies are? So let's just look at some of the considerations for policies dealing with centralization or decentralization of command. Very important. We often hear in practice that the tax people are the last people that know what's happening in an organization, and that's not where you want to be. So there should be a policy that everybody understands that flow information takes place. So where does that center of command sit? So you'll have policy on reporting lines, policy on transparency in the VAT function. In other words, don't go about the argument or don't raise the argument, SARS will never pick this up. That should be something which is against the policy of the organization. Policy on dealing with non-compliance with stated policies. So that will not create an environment where people are fear of what's happening or what they could potentially be exposed to. It should be a remedy towards making certain it doesn't happen again, and how do you strengthen your organization to avoid those kind of occurrences. Then we have policies dealing with compliance issues, policies on the identification, recording or measurement of VAT risks. That's often left because it's not seen as a priority, because so many other things have to be done. But there has to be a policy. Remember, we talked about developing those tax risk maps. If you have a tax manager in your organization responsible for the VAT function, that person should have a detailed analysis of where the risks in that organization sit. And then, very important, policies with regards to external communication. Who goes to SARS? When do a person go to SARS? How do you deal with feedback from SARS? Very, very important. So let's now look at some of the standard policies or the policy statements that are included in your material, and that will give you a sense of how you link the two issues. Policy statement number 1, the classification is the VAT operations and risks. Topic, overall responsibility for VAT compliance, so where does the buck stop? Responsibility for overall VAT compliance is centralized at the executive level. That is, if everything goes wrong, that is, or anything goes wrong, that's where the buck stops. But you'll see from now on, you'll build a policy and procedure that will deal with the lower level responsibility. It can't be, I can now do as a regional manager whatever I want because the tax manager is responsible for that. And those links need to be there. One thing that's missing there is of course the effective date of that policy. If a policy is there but it hasn't been formally implemented, it hasn't been given an effective date, then the policy is worth nothing. There's policy statement number 2. Classification, again, we're looking at VAT operations and risks. This has to do with the reporting lines. The VAT executive reports directly to the corporate head of tax and the audit committee. So you create that line of communication, that line of responsibility and reporting, and you tailor that to your organization's specific needs. Then statement number 3, VAT operations and risks. What about transparency? ABC's policy is one of total transparency in respect of all stakeholders, including SARS, in respect of tax matters. That is a strong statement, and that leaves the argument or the viewpoint that only when SARS is likely to pick it up will it become an issue. That takes it out. It says all decisions we make, everything we do is based on SARS knowing everything. Okay. Policy statement number 4, again we're looking at VAT operations and risks. What about non-compliance tolerance? ABC has a policy of 0 tolerance in respect of non-compliance with official company VAT policy. Now that is a strong position to take, but probably the only one that will have an impact on how effectively these policies are included or implemented. Then policy statement number 5, disclosure of non-compliance at operational level. ABC has a policy of full disclosure of all compliance failures. So there's a policy, and next time we'll see how do you take that policy and bring it into a procedure. The policy is everything shall be disclosed. So once there's something that requires disclosure, it must be disclosed, and the procedure will tell you how that disclosure takes place. There you've got another policy statement, number 6. We're still dealing with VAT operations and risks. The measurement of risk. Formal methodologies must be operative to identify measures and report all significant VAT risks. Ties in with the policy we talked about previously. Now it says you shall have a policy and a procedure in place and a methodology to measure those risks. And the methodology isn't prescribed, but the need for the methodology is a prescribed policy. Then we look at policy statement number 7, a liaison with revenue authorities, critical. Only the VAT executive or a person authorized by the VAT executive may conduct any correspondence or communication with tax-related authorities. And this is something that should not be negotiable in any organization. Then if you want to have a look at more, there's 22 more of these examples in the material, in the handbook. You're welcome to have a look at that. So that ends this session. In the next session, we'll look at some of the procedures to support the policy, because the policy is worth nothing unless it can be implemented. Until then, Chris Teron, checking out for Tradetaxplus Management Services.